Good evening. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History at the CUNY Graduate School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. If it's your first time to the Gotham Center, I invite you to learn more about us online at gothamcenter.org, where you can find nearly 1,000 articles, hundreds of podcasts, and other event recordings, dozens of book talks, digital exhibits, and more on all things New York City history. Those of you looking for a deeper dive may also be interested in our online education program, Gotham Ed. You can find more information on that at gothamed.com. Tonight, as part of our regular series featuring the best and most interesting new work on the city's history, we'll be discussing Lynne Sagalyn's new book, Times Square. Let's get this full title correct. Times Square Remade, The Dynamics of Urban Change. 20 years ago, our guests tonight published a book examining Times Square's most recent transformation, debunking the myth that Rudolph Giuliani's administration, with the help of giant corporations like Disney, engineered its spectacular transformation in the 1990s, which became a model for cities around the world. Instead, Sagalyn, a widely acclaimed scholar, gave us a far more complex story, combining historical narrative with careful financial and political analysis to capture the complexity and indeed the excitement of large-scale public-private partnerships, which have come to define urban renewal and urban development in our time. In her new book, she comes back to West 42nd Street to ask what has made this place such a continual icon for well over a century, demanding the homage of nearly every tourist, capturing the imagination of so many writers and photographers, and commanding the nostalgia of New Yorkers in each period of its history. In these few square blocks, she argues one can see the physical, social, and economic dislocations of these periods in four distinct ages of change. Times Square's regeneration has been driven continually by its visual power, Sagalyn argues, its spectacle and repeated iteration as, yes, quote, Sodom on the Hudson. But the largest force shaping Times Square, as she argues persuasively, has been real estate, the handmaiden of growth in New York, and indeed most cities during the late modern age. The opening of Grand Central Terminal in 1913 kicked off this sequence, the revolution of rail, starting the process of turning Midtown into New York City's premier business district. After World War II, the West Side docks and industry of Manhattan disappeared, and the office skyscrapers came in, along with other symbols of the new New York, like the UN. The 1970s saw yet another period of change, the end of that golden age of post-war capitalism, the rapid increase of globalization, the era of, quote, urban decline, following decades of post-war mass suburbanization. And now in our time, 42nd Street is once again defined by large macroeconomic forces. Hudson Yards, the city's largest development project in many decades, standing at one end, completed just a few years before the COVID-19 pandemic, raised the question that still lingers of how Midtown may be transformed yet again. What the future holds, of course, is anyone's guess, but tonight you'll hear from this unrivaled expert on the past of Times Square, the dynamics of change that have remade it continually over the past 125 years. We are delighted and privileged to be led in conversation tonight by John Mollenkoff, CUNY's own giant scholar of urban life and change. Allow me to briefly introduce our two guests here. Lynne Sagalyn is Professor Emerita of Real Estate at Columbia Business School, where she was formerly the director of the MBA Real Estate Program and the founding director of the Paul Milstein Center for Real Estate. She has published extensively on a broad range of issues in urban development finance, public-private partnerships, and real estate finance, and is widely known for her research on city building. Her book, Power at Ground Zero, Politics, Money, and the Rebuilding of Lower Manhattan, is well-regarded, rightly so, as the definitive account of that rebuilding challenge, and her earlier books include Times Square Roulette, which I mentioned a minute ago, and the co-authored classic Downtown Inc., How America Rebuilds Cities. She serves currently on the board of the Blackstone Mortgage Trust, and chairs the advisory board of Morgan Stanley Prime Property Fund. She's a member of the board of directors of the Regional Plan Association, the Skyscraper Museum, and is vice president on the board of the New York City Trust for Cultural Resources. I am so delighted to welcome her back to the Gotham Center. John Molikoff, our discussant and interview this evening, is the Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Sociology at CUNY's Graduate Center and the director of its Center for Urban Research. His teaching and research interests focus on urban politics and public policy, using New York City as a case study in comparison with similar large cities in the US and Europe to understand urban political mobilization, immigrant political incorporation, and the formation of governing coalitions. He has authored or edited 18 books on this subject and won numerous prizes for that work, including the Distinguished Book Award of the ASA and the Michael Harrington Award from the APSA. He has also served as a consultant to many government agencies, and the center that he directs, the Center for Urban Research, undertakes applied policy research for many government agencies, community organizations, and philanthropies in New York. It's a pleasure, of course, to welcome him again back to another Gotham Center event. One final bit of housekeeping. Lynne is going to kick us off in a minute with a brief overview of the book, and then John will come and join us for a conversation. The chat feature, as always, has been disabled. Out of respect to our speakers, I ask you to use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to send us your questions. You can do that at any time during the next hour. We will begin answering those questions at 7:30. So with that, I hope you will join me at home in welcoming our guests with some silent applause.
Thank you, Peter. It's really a pleasure to be back here at an event sponsored by the Gotham Center. It's one of my favorite places to give talks. It takes me a while to write a book, so it doesn't happen as frequently as I might like. The first question I'm always asked about Times Square Remade is why I have decided to write a second book on Times Square. And the answer is pretty simple, which is after 20 years, 22 years, it really was time to look at what impact the transformation had. And too often, scholars look at what happened, but then we finish something and we never go back to it. And I thought it was important to go back to look at what it transformation had, what impact it had. And I wanted to do that from a particular perspective. I wanted to do it historically by looking at the kind of real estate activity post-World War II that started to activate the area in a different way. And I wanted to, in particular, understand the westward impact of the transformation, because 42nd Street, West 42nd Street, had always been considered a kind of blockade to Western development. So the book is organized in a way that follows those interests. So there are a couple of chapters on the history of the area, including Hell's Kitchen, that looks at the history from a real estate perspective. I talk about the results of the 42nd Street transformation, what the city got out of it, and how it affected Times Square in general. And then it was really quite interesting when the trigger for this book really was about 2015 and the pedestrianization of the Times Square bow tie area. And what manifested quite early was a whole bunch of anxieties about how this public space was being used. And I was really interested in the public space issues. It's impossible to write a book about Times Square without talking about the iconic commercial signage, which is really what I think makes Times Square so iconic and what draws not only tourists, but New Yorkers alike to the spectacle of the extravagant light shows that play out every night. And then at the end of the book, I take a deep look at the impacts on Hell's Kitchen and the slow to very rapid to full throttle gentrification of that area following the clear probability that 42nd Street was going to be finally transformed. And then the last chapter looks at the the kind of reflections of the passage of time, what it means for an area like Times Square and Hell's Kitchen to go through 120 years of history and how it changes, because the bigger picture story of the book really is about urban change and how there are certain contradictions in time as neighborhoods move through change that's been driven by economics and demographics. So that's a sort of the broad outline of why I wanted to write this book and how it's organized.
Well, I'd like to join Lynne in thanking the Gotham Center and Peter for organizing this event and given me a reason to just read several times and soak myself in Lynne's wonderful book, which has, many brilliant chapters in it, and to thank Lynne for doing it. Let me just preface first question by saying that my first job in moving to New York City in 1980 was heading the Economic Development Division of the New York City Department of City Planning when Herb Sturz was leading the agency. And my introduction to New York City planning was really steeped in these conversations and discussions that were going on at a pivotal time in the evolution of the project. And one of the things that I was taught in that period by Peter Magnani, who was head of the Queensborough office at that time, and he was later deputy bureau president in Queens, he said that every major development in New York City is to play in at least 3 acts in which there are early and middle versions of plans that could be very grandiose, but they were destined for the track heap because objections would rise and difficulties would be encountered and they would not go forward. But finally, there would be a concluding act in which something actually got done. And that if I expected anything to happen quickly in New York, I was going to be sadly disabused of that. And the proper time span for looking at anything, a project was maybe 20 or 30 years. And I think this is an excellent example of that axiom that it does take a long time to get something done in New York City. But you can't conclude from that nothing ever will get done. And I think this is an example of how New York City can find its way, negotiate its way through many complexities and difficulties, finally to actually bring about change. The other thing to note is that my first academic position in New York was at the old building of the Graduate Center, which was on the north side of 42nd Street, just east of 6th Avenue. So between 1981 and 1999, I was walking daily through, or at least during the work week, through a lot of everything that Lynne was writing about in that period, including at one point in the crack epidemic, somebody being murdered in a drug deal right across the street from the Graduate Center. And so it's, the book really captures the meat, the fabric of everyday life in these different periods in a wonderful way. But I'd like to begin by asking Lynne, what do you think are the hidden stories behind the success of the project?
Before I mention the hidden stories, I would just say, John, I was always of the opinion that plans never work. The first plan never works. It's always the second plan, and maybe it takes the third plan.
Yes,
It's the same kind of axiom that you were operating under.
for sure.
And that's been true at look at Columbus Circle. That it's true at more than one project in New York City, and I would say in other big cities as well. Finding the hidden stories of this project was one of the real motivating factors. The first is that, people don't really know, and it took me a fair amount of digging to understand the economic returns to the city. They were actually, much larger than I think any of the original policy people ever anticipated they would be. Let me just sort of give you some sense of that. It's really hard to do a cost-benefit analysis of this project, but we can track a few metrics of success. One is the growing property values of the area, which were quite large. The second is, the land underneath I'm gonna ask Peter to put in a slide, slide 7. The land underneath 42nd Street is all leased to different entities. Usually it was the Empire State Development Corporation. The underlying land is now owned by the city of New York, and those lands are managed by the Economic Development Corporation. And so the Economic Development Corporation collects revenues, project rents, and of a variety of different means from the area. And so, to give you an example of the project rents growing steadily, in 2011, 2012, EDC took in $29 million from what's called the Apple 42 project. By 2020, it was taking in $67 million a year. These were large amounts of revenue that could be used for discretionary policy purposes. And so over a period of 10 years between 2011 and 2021, EDC captured $476 million from the Apple 42 project. They used a good chunk of that money to capitalize the New York City ferry system, which most people don't know about. Most people don't understand the magnitude of the revenues that can accrue from a real estate development in which the land is owned by the city. It was very, very successful. A second hidden story was the unusual source of revenues for the New 42. Peter, if you can pull up a slide that looks like New 42 that has the ferry system. Yeah, I think it's slide 8. It's slide 8. I talked about the ferry system. The Youth Theater, New 42nd Street, is supported by payments from rent payments from the theaters on the street, all theaters but the New Amsterdam, and an interesting clause in the lease of the office buildings, which require the landlords of the office buildings to pay 10 cents per square foot to the New 42. These revenues make it possible for the youth theater not just to provide theater for young audiences, but to sponsor an usher corps and a mentorship program for people graduating from the usher corps who want to go into careers in performing arts. What this means, these are large amounts of revenues that I think in 2019 covered about 50% of the New 42's $20 million operating budget. What this means is that the youth theater and its programs do not have to depend upon the box office for its economic viability. The real estate that the New 42 controls is really an endowment, and the New 42 has a 99-year lease on the theater sites. So this is not just a short-term economic phenomenon for the theater entity. And the theater is a nonprofit that is independent of political interference. So those three attributes, independence, long-term lease on real estate, and revenues coming from the success of the street in general, create an unusual structure to facilitate theater for youth on 42nd Street, which in itself seemed to be ironic because there had been no children's theater in New York City until 1996, 1998, when the new 42 opened, the new Victory Theater on Naughty Bawdy 42nd Street. It was the first big announcement. So that's the second hidden story that very few people know about. And I was privileged to interview Cora Khan at length about the development of the new 42 and its unusual structure. The third hidden story is the one I think really is deeply hidden, which is as part of the 1984 debate about the 42nd Street Development Project, the Hell's Kitchen community, then really going by the name of Clinton as opposed to Hell's Kitchen, was very concerned, legitimately so, about the impacts of gentrification that would likely happen to impact their neighborhood once 42nd Street was transformed. And as part of the negotiations with the city, Mayor Koch had promised $15 million to the community for kind of mitigation of impending gentrification. And as Koch told me, at the 11th hour, he had to pledge another $10 million, so that Clinton got $25 million, which is really $70 million in today's monies. And they used that monies for legal services to staunch the tide of displacement, acquiring dilapidated buildings and distressed buildings and renovating them. And most significantly, they provided bathrooms, 3-piece bathrooms, a toilet, a sink, and a tub in tenements that only had toilets in the hallway or other kind, and the rest of the shared facilities. They were formerly single-room occupancy units. And the reason these bathrooms were so important was that the tenants, the low-income tenants, could not get rent subsidies if they did not have a 3-piece bathroom with a door. So these are the important unheralded stories of what quid pro quo dollars bring, what negotiations can bring in public-private developments, and what kind of returns the city can benefit from owning land under its name.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. And the whole question of the very complex package of benefits and where they go and to whom and costs and on whom those costs are imposed is central to figuring out whether we think this was all worth it or not. And so that leads me to two other questions, and let me pose them so we don't forget them. And the first is, well, who paid, what were the costs of the program or the project trajectory, and who paid them? In what ways you've mentioned some ways in which they could have been diminished possibly. And the other question is about leadership and the importance of a leader like Herb Sturz, who had an excellent capability of selecting people to work with him who were extremely innovative. And Cora Khan is one of them. So where did ideas come from about how, okay, let's see if we can make this as progressive as possible or do as innovative possible things like a youth theater or the 3-piece bathrooms. What was it about? How did a person like Herb get into that spot, and how was he able to pull it off, basically?
Let me start
with that one?
Question. Herb was an exceptional person. He was a person with deep ambitions for providing for what the city needed, and the people, the neediest people who needed things in the city. And when he became city planning commissioner, he believed that economic development was a key to bolstering the city's economic capacity to provide for its citizens. Remember, New York City was literally on the verge of bankruptcy, all but bankruptcy declared in 1975. Koch came in 1978. Herb had an earlier position, but then as Koch worked through his ideas of economic development as a singular strategy for getting the city into stronger financial footing, he made Herb city planning commissioner. And, Herb didn't come up with the idea for the 42nd Street Development Project. Actually, there was a prior project sponsored by the Ford Foundation called the City at 42nd Street, which had many of the same elements that we then saw in the 42nd Street Development Project. And that was to push all of, Peter, if you go back to slide 7, if you move all of the density allowed in the project area to the east, to 4 corners where you could build office buildings, you could incentivize the developers who would build these office buildings. You would incentivize them with property tax abatements and high density, which would allow you to finance the rest of the street's activity. This was a time when New York City could not enter the bond market. And so I can't point out maybe I can, these 4 office sites here. And so they had the leadership had to come up with a fairly clever way for the private sector to pay the costs of public condemnation. This project area that you see outlined in dots is the 42nd Street redevelopment project area, 13 acres, both sides of 42nd Street, crosses over on Broadway to the east to the site where the Condé Nast building is now, and it goes south where the New York Times building is. But the city was broke, and it had no money to fund public acquisition of private property, which in itself, because this was a commercial project, was fairly controversial. It was the first commercial project that was used, the first time eminent domain was used for a commercial project. Lincoln Center was not a commercial project, it was a cultural project. And other times that eminent domain was used, it was used for residential. But this was a purely commercial project. And so they came up with this kind of very clever financing strategy in which they would incentivize developers with property tax abatements and higher density, and developers would front the costs for acquiring the land, and that would be a loan to the city, and the loan would be paid back with credits against the payments in lieu of taxes that these developers would have to pay. And it was an ingenious, ultimately controversial, as most things are in the city, project financing device, but it really was what allowed the city to move forward with plans to what was literally to cleanse the street. The theaters were not going to be raised, nor was the Carter Hotel, which is not part of the project, nor was the New Amsterdam Theater, but everything else was pretty much going to be cleared. So that's the, who paid what is the full answer to that question is a little more complicated. The private sector paid for most of the condemnation for 2/3 of the project area. And on the western side, the city by then was in stable financial condition, and the city paid the costs of acquiring the land for what we now know to be the Ewok site and the Westin Hotel, and the southern office tower, 11 Times Square, was a whole different arrangement because the Milstein family had bought that parcel. So it's truly a public-private project in terms of financing, who paid what for the land.
I was thinking a little more broadly of what was gained and what was lost. We know we have a pretty clear idea of what was gained, but in terms of what was lost, yes, there was a lot of theaters showing softcore pornography and the sex emporium and some degree of prostitution, but probably more drug dealing. And it had a depressive effect on the area for sure, but it was also a place that allowed very marginal people to feel like they fit in, or it was theirs, or they were comfortable there, or they could do a hustle there, and that was erased. So I think my question is also, I mean, maybe we have no regrets to lose all that, but in general, with this sort of high level transformation of New York City and Midtown, what kinds of little mom and pop stores, or what kind of neighborhood hangouts, or what kind of behind the scenes activities that people might still want to engage in were sort of erased.
There were I wouldn't say there were many mom and pop stores on 42nd Street because the rents were high. Porn brings in a lot of money. And so the rents were high, but you did have second story. You had boxing club on the second story. You had Tad's Steakhouse someplace. You did have a lot of everyday kinds of stores beside the porn stores. But you also had movie theaters, and 42nd Street was a big draw for teenagers from all the boroughs because the movies weren't all porn. There were action flicks and the like, and there are now movies back on 42nd Street, but it took the second plan to bring movies back to 42nd Street. Some of the activities that you talk about, I think, migrated to 8th Avenue. Because 8th Avenue is still in the process of what real estate people would call transition. There's a tremendous number of luxury apartment buildings there now, and condos, and hotels, but it's still pretty gritty. It's still a gritty part of Manhattan, and those of us who grew up here like the grittiness of Manhattan. So I think you can see 8th Avenue is different. It's different from. Despite the gentrification, especially the gentrification is further up. It's not in the lower 40s as much as it is in the higher 40s and certainly the 50s. But you did lose the marginal activity on 42nd Street. But I guess I would take exception. 42nd Street was not a comfortable place for women to walk.
Well, sometimes also men.
I don't think it was so comfortable for men either.
We did a study of the geography of crime with the New York City Police Department in about 1997, and it turns out that stretch of 42nd Street between 5th Avenue and over, towards the transit center was the highest sort of street crime place in the whole city. So.
Even the policemen didn't walk alone in that area.
Yeah, it was dangerous, no question. So, which brings us to the issue of the pedestrianization of certainly this Times Square area that you described, but also further down Broadway, right down to 34th Street, which. I never imagined New York City would be able to close a major artery like that and turn it into pedestrian plazas. It was really quite remarkable and astounding, really, when you think about it. But then that brought its own issues of sort of, everybody the sort of the tragedy of the commons, that everybody plunged into this free-for-all area and tried to make their own use of it. And then there was this problem of how do we create some kind of order in that setting?
It was the problem. The pedestrian effort started because there was so much congestion. It was the problem of success, the unanticipated problem of success. And then you had Janet Sadat-Khan, who, as DOT commissioner, had a real mission to increase the way people traveled around the city, and by bike, by walking more. She wanted more walkable streets. And so they ran some experiments around around Herald Square and the 34th Street area first. And then in 2009, they did pedestrianize Times Square from 43rd to 47th, the bow tie area. And it was immediately controversial. Of course, the cab drivers didn't like it. Truck drivers didn't like it. Everybody was fearful. The retailers were fearful. Even Broadway theater owners were less fearful. They were just said, let's see how the customers react. But the issue, and Peter, you can turn to slide 10 and then 11. The issue became, this was the opportunity space for belligerent as well as non-belligerent behavior. You had an enormous influx of ticket sellers, hustlers of all types, CD sellers, fake monks, costume characters, and then came the painted topless ladies. And the Times Square Alliance, at one point at the pre-pandemic on Saturday evening, the height of activity, counted 181 ticket sellers, 61 CD sellers, hawkers, fake monks, costume characters to the number of 139. You had altogether something less than 400 people trying to entice tourists to do photo ops, buy CDs or pay $20 for a photo op. And it became a problem for the aggressive panhandlers. I would just inform our audience that panhandling is not illegal in New York City. Aggressive panhandling is. And aggressive panhandling for it to be aggressive, it has to be visible to the police, and there has to be an impact. It's a fine line between panhandling and aggressive panhandling, but there really was aggressive panhandling at times in Times Square. And that created all sorts of problems. And the tabloids went to town in castigating the city for allowing painted topless ladies. It's a longer story. If you want, John, you can ask me more questions about it. But ultimately, they were hustling for tips from tourists, and it could be quite difficult for many. My favorite slide, I will show you slide 11 that Peter will put up. But it's an opportunity space. It was a natural habitat for people to try to hustle tourists. And hustling is a kind of cultural phenomenon in New York City. It's not that hustling is bad. We're kind of used to it, but tourists aren't so used to it.
So I know the COVID era isn't something that you have developed a whole chapter on in the book, but there was also an astounding period there in the deepest period of mid 2020 and late 2020, when the streets of Midtown Manhattan were just eerily empty. And we had this discussion about work from home, whether the office is now something that's outmoded. And I'm wondering how those 4 office buildings that are anchors of the Times Square project. How are they doing? Are people back to work? I'm certainly, the crowds have completely returned
Yeah.
to Times Square, as nearly as I can tell. It's as crowded as it ever was.
And by the way, it was the office workers and the landlords who were most concerned about what was going on in Times Square, because they worried that it would impact the tenantry who would not want to be there in the chaos. I mean, a certain amount of chaos is part of Times Square. Let's face it.
Right.
It's not a neat, regulated place. But what happened post-pandemic is that, Times Square was not immune from the problems of 50 to maybe 55% of workers back in the office on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And a lot, and what's happened from a real estate perspective in office markets is that the most desirable tenants have gravitated to the newest buildings, which are at Hudson Yards or downtown in Lower Manhattan at the World Trade Center. And so the owners of the four towers, for example, are leasing up, but when tenants leave, they have to find new tenants. And it's not easy. It's tough right now. And they're not getting the same tenants that they did in the first round of leasing. They're getting second-tier tenants, maybe, what people in the trade would call second-tier tenants, but there's still tenants paying the rent. So which is really important, because one of the motivating factors for the city in cleansing 42nd Street was not just to cleanse it of the porn, but was to bring economic diversity to the area. They wanted a use mix. They wanted offices as well as entertainment and theater. And so when the office buildings became vulnerable during the pandemic, it's worrisome. And landlords wanted to get a second round of tax abatements, but the city said no. And that, I think, was right from a policy perspective. Rents drop, you'll get tenants.
Yes.
That's what happens.
It's not always easy to project the future as a direct line from the past, but what do you foresee for over the next 10 years about how Times Square will evolve, given the sort of odd conjunction between the masses of people milling around in the uncontrolled or semi-controlled space of Times Square and the corporate tenants of the office buildings that are paying the bill at some level?
Yeah, well, I think the chaos of close to 400 kind of hawkers and hustlers in Times Square has mediated some. A number of the costume characters were immigrants, legal or illegal, who were using that venue to basically earn money to pay for their families living and eating. And there was a tremendous amount during the hearings about how to regulate Times Square chaos. There was tremendous empathy and understanding that needed to be maintained. You needed to allow this kind of activity, and the tourists loved some of it, except for the aggressive pieces of it. So I think there are fewer costume character multiples of Elmo and Mickey and Minnie, because those people have gone on to find other ways of supporting their families, because 2.5 years of not being able to do that is difficult. We don't have data on any of that, but that's what I suspect happened. The office buildings are there. They're not movable. They're big, expensive investments, and they will re-tenant. It will take some time. And as I said, I don't think it's likely to be the same Class A tenants that tenanted those buildings to begin with. But I think it's imperative that we maintain that mix from a policy perspective, because you don't want Times Square to be a singular tourist activity. It's not New York to have only this kind of tourist zone. And so the mix is important. And Time's going to I mean, there's no immediate answer, but I don't think it's going to take 10 years. I think it could take 2 or 3 more years till
Mhm.
the whole work at home business really settles out. I don't think it's going to remain at the same level it is today. It's been
Well, certainly it seems to me that the management wants people back in the office, and probably firms are more productive when people work collectively and can interact all the time. But on the other hand, there's so many benefits of more flexibility, less commuting, people being happier, having some more autonomy, that I don't think it's ever going to go back 100% to the way it was
I agree.
before.
It's going to be this hybrid model, and it's going to vary by type of business. You know, if you're in the financial services of deal making and transactions, you're going to be in the office 3 to 4
Mhm.
days a week, maybe not on Fridays. But I mean, you know, the big companies, the big Wall Street companies in Midtown, they want their people back. And you're not, I think there's also the question of how ambitious you are. If you're ambitious and you want to progress in a career, you're going to be in the office because, as you said, that's how you facilitate the networking. That's how you learn things literally at the proverbial water cooler. But on the other hand, there are lots of jobs, back office jobs, that you don't need to be in the office. And land and businesses will likely reduce the amount of space that they lease, because there's more office sharing, and you don't need the same amount of space as you did pre-pandemic. Many businesses, and that's going to impact the city. That's going to impact the fiscal profile of the city. No question. We just don't know how big it's going to be.
But it could open up space for alternate uses also,
Oh, absolutely.
or supplanting complementary uses of different kinds.
You never quite know what's going to, you can't predict the future, because when rents drop, all of a sudden you get businesses, and in Times Square, you're getting restaurants opening who never could have afforded the space before because those rents have dropped. So, you know, there's typically a silver lining to the downturns that of real estate markets. But the short term is always the focus on all the negatives, but there really will be some benefits here, but it just takes time, and it's great uncertainty, and it's not, there are a lot of problems in the office market right now, and it's not going to get better before it may get worse before it gets better.
Well, if you contrast it with the situation on Market Street in downtown San Francisco, it's a much better situation than
New York looks very good.
in a
We
lot
do
of
have the
other.
right to shelter, and we do have I think we have a lot more experience in dealing with the issues, and we have a much more diverse economy than San Francisco.
So let me ask one last question before we go to question and answer with the audience. One of the slides that you have in one of the plates in the book shows 42nd Street from the East River over to the Hudson. And since the days of the Regional Plan Association, I think there's been a sort of ambition or desire to see something more cohesive completely across the street. And there was at one point talk about putting in, some sort of rail transit that would go back and forth down the street. And if we broaden out the scope from beyond the 42nd Street development project and look at the whole, I mean, one of the motives behind the whole project was to balance the development on the east side of Midtown with more development on the west side. And given the way the subway lines run up and down, and yes, the 7 line does run underneath, but there's sort of a bifurcation between the east and the west. And there was some hope that somehow it could all be tied together laterally rather than horizontally. And what do you think is going to happen on that front, or how much? I mean, certainly
Fred Papper for years had the dream of the 42nd Street trolley to have an east-west transit line. Right now, the east-west transit line are people on bikes.
Right.
and bikes east, west, north, south, everywhere. But I think, 42nd Street now is actually all built up in terms, and I put those slides in, those images about crosstown 42nd Street, because it's really an extraordinary street, starting from 40, from the east side, the UN, and really Tudor City, all the way to the west side. And it's just a ribbon of outstanding development that Ada Louise Huxtable wrote about, decades ago, but still is evidence of the kind of impact, or the kind of impact the physical environment has on the image of a city. I mean, 42nd Street and it's just got one fabulous building after another, and monumental buildings. And so it's a real testimony to things that I care about, and others, about the physical fabric of the city, and why we all write about that, that it is the space we live in and work in, and it's special to me.
So now I know that I think Peter is going to handle a series of questions that have been received from the audience and share those with us. Is that right, Peter?
That is correct. So our first question comes in from an anonymous viewer who asks, why was the Hotel Carter not included in the redevelopment project?
The Hotel Carter and the New Amsterdam were not included. I know why the New Amsterdam wasn't, because it was just an extraordinary theater. The Carter, I don't really know the story behind why the Carter wasn't. I suspect there's a political story. It was not something that I looked into in the first book, and I certainly didn't touch on it in the second. The Carter Hotel was actually built in something like 1923. It was called the Dixie Hotel. And it, I think the Carter Hotel, by the time that 42nd Street, John, you may know this, it might have been a hotel for welfare recipients or low-income residents. And the city would not have, if I had to guess if that was the case, the city would have had to find new apartments for those people, and that would have been very difficult. So they just, and it was high density to begin with, and it probably made no sense to tear it, to put it in part of the project area and then demolish it, where most of the other structures were all 2 or maybe 3-story structures. Even the corner building on 42nd and 7th was only 3 stories.
Sounds very plausible. Peter, we can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Sorry. Next question. Did any of the mom and pops evicted from 42nd receive aid in relocating?
They probably did, because on 42nd Street there were layers of leases, and the condemnation awards also included awards for fixtures, the stuff that's in a shop. I only had the aggregate numbers, but so I can't be specific about that. There weren't that many mom and pop shops. I mean, there were some restaurants. There was, famous luncheonette, the Grand Luncheonette. But then again, if they were tenants as opposed to landowners, building owners, they probably received very little, is my guess.
Another question about the scale of tourism. They asked, do you know the ratio of tourists to locals in Times Square now? Not really.
No, the Times Square Alliance would, but I'm sure it's imbalanced. I'm sure that it's, on the order of 70-30 or 80-20. I mean, New Yorkers, I walk through Times Square. I mean, you go in certain places, you go through Times Square, and the one attraction, there are 2 attractions I think that matter for New Yorkers if they're there. One is the Red Steps, which are spectacular, a spectacular viewing platform just to watch what goes on. And the second attraction are the lights, are the commercial advertisements. And they still amaze many New Yorkers, myself included. They've just been innovative over time. They keep getting, I may not like them as much as the old mechanical signs like the Camelman's blue smoke rings, but times change.
Andrew Sparberg, hi Andy, writes that, said, I need to mention something about how the subways really put Times Square on the map, beginning in 1904 when the first subway line opened there. The biggest expansions below Times Square occurred between 1917 and 1927, and without subway access, you would not have Times Square as we know it. Presentation did mention the 2 commuter rail stations near Times Square, Grand Central and Penn, but remember the biggest single chunk of transit riders to and from Midtown are subway riders.
Well, the subway, I mean, this is a debate among historians and real estate people. Historians believe, Mike Wallace, and I trust Mike Wallace's interpretation of this. Mike Wallace believes that it was the competition between the theaters and the theater syndicates that built so many theaters in Times Square. I mean, literally, you wouldn't believe that in an 8-year period, I had the number somewhere, between 1900 and 1928, there were 76 theaters built in Times Square. True, that there's no question that the transportation nexus in Times Square made the area, but there were a confluence of factors happening at the same time. You had the competition among the theater builders and producers. You had the subway coming on, and you had the Times moving its headquarters to the triangle, which is now One Times Square. So, I mean, there's just a debate as to what was the single most important thing. Real estate people believe it's transportation because that's the way they look at the world. Historians sort of see a more complex kind of nuance to the story, but they're both right. I mean, we don't have to choose one or the other. We know within a short period of time, there was a confluence of factors that made Times Square the centrality of Midtown. And remember, the Grand Central Terminal isn't built until 1913, the new one, the one we see today. And the East Side office development, that whole East Midtown, doesn't take off really until after the terminal opens. Before that, Midtown activity was on the West Side. And one of those pictures that John mentioned at the last chapter that shows 42nd Street cross section, there's a historic image one, and you see the East Side, other than, is really low density, and all the activity is over on Times Square. It eventually balances out.
Next question. Were theaters part of the original plan? This question for Bernard Belkin.
Yes. The original plan provided that there had to be, first of all, the monies that went to acquire the 2/3 of the street were monies that were also spent to buy the theaters, the mid-block theaters. And the mid-block theaters, the preservation of the mid-block theaters was from get-go, day one, always a factor, was always part of the plan. It wasn't the priority when it came to really understanding the deal making, but it was always part of the plan. And the monies that the private developers laid out to purchase 2/3 of the block included purchasing of those theaters. And the requirement for the new 42 was that 2 of the theater buildings had to be used for nonprofit theater. So actually you have 3 on the block now that are nonprofit theaters.
Andrew Sparger has followed up with a question. So that's why I'm not quite sure what that refers to now, but that's why the theaters moved uptown from 34th Street as George Cohen said in Remember Me to Herald Square.
Well, the Rialto is what the theater district was called, had been moved up from 28th Street, 23rd, 28th Street to 34th Street. And when Hammerstein opened the Olympia in 1895, crossed the deadline, as 42nd Street was called, it was no man's land. But shortly thereafter, by 1900, the theaters start to come to 42nd Street, which is still called Longacre Square. And they really concentrate in the Times Square area. And when Broadway lands become too expensive, they go into the side streets. So you really don't see a lot of theaters on the Broadway face of Times Square, because the land becomes too expensive. But yes, they do depart Herald Square.
Nancy Sharon writes, there used to be a small second floor dance/performance studio that could be rented inexpensively in Times Square as late as the 60s and 70s. Where have they gone if they still exist?
Well, I don't know where the ones she's mentioning have gone, but the new 42 opened what's called 42nd Street Studios, and it is a rehearsal space. There's a Duke Black Box Theater below, but there are rehearsal spaces up above, and those rehearsal spaces are primarily, but not exclusively, rented to nonprofit performing arts organizations. And I have a picture of of one of the studios, and the rents from the private organizations that rent those rehearsal spaces cross-subsidize the lower costs for the nonprofit rehearsal spaces. Rehearsal spaces are really important use for the Times Square Theater District. And so when the new 42 built that building, it's the site of the old Selwyn Theater, it was really Coracon's, brilliance to make it a rehearsal building.
If I could jump in here, Lynn, what accounts for, I mean, if this was a project being done in, I don't mean to cast aspersions on Dallas, but let's say if it's being done in Dallas, it would just be straight maximize return on investment and everything else be damned. And here we have all of these cross subsidies, and let's build in a shelter for this, or let's have dance studios. What is it about New York or that period of planning or the particular people that were mobilized around the issue that led us to insist on all of that, as opposed to something that's just a straight cash deal?
I think it was both the times, but I think it was the people. I think it was Herb was a part of that. Herb, he believed, he believed in helping the city recover in economic base to help the people who had lost out by the cutbacks during that fiscally pressed era. And the original plan for 42nd Street required those nonprofit theaters. And maybe in Dallas they might have sold those parcels at too cheap a price. But the reason the city didn't sell them outright is because the project was driven by a coalition of the state and the city. And the state had different powers, had more powers to craft deals with developers and craft property tax abatement deals. And that allowed the city to do things that it otherwise might not have been able to do it if it just sold the parcels outright, which they would have gotten very low value for the parcels outright, even though the location was prime because of the tenor of the times. So I think there is something about the culture of the city and the culture of that area, John. The fact that it was Times Square and we were losing, Music Row on I think it was 48th Street, had all the music shops there. That's all gone on the internet now. And you were losing rehearsal spaces. You were losing things. And
losing the movie theaters too. I mean,
yeah. And you didn't want to lose all of that. And so there were attempts. There was a zoning law that required in the 80s that required rehearsal space, 5% of the space ground level for rehearsal space. And the whole effort to regulate signage, glaring, garish signage, was part to maintain the culture of the area. There were big fights over all of this, but I do think it would not have happened in Dallas, even though Dallas has an arts district. It's very, it's not Times Square.
Lynn, Lydia Ravnikar asks, are there any historic buildings remaining? The Hotel Astor was turned down, obviously, but are there other landmarks?
Are there any what buildings remaining?
Historic buildings.
Oh, yes. The New Amsterdam Theater is historic. The Candler Building, which is another building that was not in the project area, which is next door to the New Amsterdam Building. That was the first skyscraper west of 6th Avenue, actually west of 5th Avenue, built in 1924. So that's there. You have the Times Square.
Wasn't the American Standard Building west of 5th Avenue built earlier?
And you have the Aeolian Building. So there
Yes.
are 6th Avenue has a few more than west of 7th.
We had another question actually asking, I think you were just about to mention the Times Building, asking to the current use of the Times Building.
Oh, well, there are two big new entertainment happenings, I should call them, going on. One is the one at 49th Street, where the Crown Plaza Hotel used to be, the FXS project with the big platform where they raised the Palace Theater. And the other big transformation is the One Times Square building, which is under scaffolding right now. It's being totally repurposed into an entertainment venue, but it looks nothing. It's like the third iteration of what the Times building originally looked like. The skeleton is there, but nothing else of the past is there, except probably underneath because that was the first New York Times headquarters in Midtown. So there's stuff underneath that may still be there, but it's all gone.
Well, maybe we can get a little window in the sidewalk like the first City Hall. Reva Cooper asks, was the Manhattan Plaza real estate development another factor in gentrifying Times Square?
Manhattan Plaza project, which was 1977, was really significant, especially for the performing arts community, because 70% of the building, which was the project was originally built as private middle class housing, ran into various kinds of troubles that are too detailed to go into here. But it subsequently received federal rent subsidies, which allowed a broad section of people in the community, both from the performing arts community and Hell's Kitchen, to rent apartments. It is not viewed by the real estate community as the most significant harbinger of change because it was subsidized. It was publicly subsidized. The metric for the real estate industry is the first private investment in the street, and that comes in there is a small renovation of a warehouse building west of 8th Avenue in the early, about 1983, but the first big buildings start in 1987. It's a place called Riverwalk that the Macklows, I think, did, and then Silverstein has bought 42nd Street and 12th Avenue, and then it all goes from by the mid 90s. Gentrification has taken root in Hell's Kitchen, and it just goes bonkers in the aughts.
Another question, and this might be our last unless we get some more. Panelist or viewer writes, the number of hotels continues to increase. Construction of 47th and 7th, and on the 47th Street, on 47th Street now between 7th and 6th. The Palace and the hotel project at the corner have been massive. What are your thoughts on this development? Will the tourist population continue to increase enough to make this a good idea? will there be a casino in Times Square?
It's interesting about the hotel phenomenon. The hotel sector has actually got a new lease on life, especially in Times Square, because as John mentioned earlier, Times Square is just chock full of people these days. And their hotels, the Hilton Hotel on 42nd Street closed during the pandemic. And they opened a new one further up in Times Square in the high 40s, I believe. And but 8th Avenue is full of new hotels, and they are hotels like that have to be financed privately by banks, and banks are not risk takers. They hold our money. They're not risk takers. So going forward, I think you'll see perhaps even more hotels. I mean, even before the pandemic, a large percentage of all new hotel rooms were in the Times Square area. And those who are really interested in it, you can go online to the Times Square Alliance. They report all this information and data. But the casino, who knows? Who knows? I think there probably are better places for the casino in terms of attracting and revitalizing areas than Times Square. Times Square doesn't need a casino, in my opinion. It might get it, but it's not that it needs it like other areas might.
Well, I suppose I'm not supposed to weigh in with an opinion representing a public institution, but that sounds very reasonable to me. Lynne, I want to say congratulations. This is a fantastic book. I wish you all the best success. I encourage everyone watching to go out and buy a copy. We will be sending out the video to everyone who registered and posting this to our YouTube channel. But it really was a pleasure to read, and so informative and brilliant as usual. And
I want to thank you for offering me this venue. I think you've had terrific. The center is terrific. And I've signed up for programs myself to learn various things. And you provide an important role for the community. And John, it's always so much fun to converse with you. This is not our first, and I certainly hope it's not our last. Thank you for your input.
My pleasure.
John, great to see you again. Thank you as well.
Well, thanks for everything you do, Peter.
I'm sure we'll see each other soon. All right, thank you all for tuning in. I want to wish you all a good evening, and I hope you will join us again at one of our future talks. We'll be meeting in a couple of weeks to talk about Madame Restell and the very different time period and very different subject. Well, maybe not that different. We'll see you then.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.